So we can read from Ephesians chapter 6, and then secondly from Lord's Day 39. Ephesians chapter 6. Again, this is the fifth commandment on authority, particularly the authority of parents in the first place. Ephesians 6 is very much a place where the Apostle Paul in the New Testament talks about that, but also slaves, interestingly. So let's start reading Ephesians chapter 6, page 950 of your Pew Bible, Ephesians 6, verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. As far Ephesians chapter 6, also Lord's Day 39 in your book of praise, if you have one with you, page 555. Lord's Day 39. What does God require in the fifth commandment? That I show all honor, love, and faithfulness to my father and mother, and to all those in authority over me. Submit myself with due obedience to their good instruction and discipline, and also have patience with their weaknesses and shortcomings, since it is God's will to govern us by their hand. As far Lord's Day 39. Congregation of Christ, here we come to the fifth commandment. Commands children to obey their parents. Now, it should be obvious to everyone that this commandment is about far more than children and parents. It's ultimately about authority in general, and who has it and who doesn't. We know it's about authority because the commandment itself is given by somebody in authority, and that's God. The commandment presupposes that God is in authority over us, and that therefore he can command us to obey other authorities that he has set in place. And all of these other forms of authority have authority because God gives it. Now, the Bible clearly teaches at least three types of authority. Parents have authority over their children, even those they foster or adopt. Elders and pastors have authority over the local congregation in the church. Right, 1 Peter 5 verse 2, be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care. And then it even says in 1 Peter 5 verse 5 to the young men, in the same way you who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders. That's number two. Number three, civil governments have authority over their ward, or whatever country or province that they are governing. Romans 13 verse 1, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. Of course, beyond these three primary forms of authority, there are also what I could call derivative authority. Classroom teacher, for example, has authority over his or her students. And my argument, at least I would make, would be that, at least in our school, for example in Credo, the parents are delegating their authority to that teacher. The parents have created the school, and therefore the teachers operate under the authority given to them by the parents. Interestingly, in the public schools, the authority is derived from the civil government, which is problematic. Not always. It used to be that there were school boards, but they're largely subservient. Again, a principle we should not admit. Besides that, another example would be a church treasurer pays bills on behalf of the church. The authority is derived from the governing council and elders. An employer has authority by virtue of the shareholders in the company, the owners of the company, give managers in that company authority over their employees. I would argue that that authority is derived from actually the civil government, because the civil government has decided in its laws that if you own a company via shares, you get to dispose of the assets of that company as you see fit. The civil government has given that authority. Contrary to Karl Marx, the workers do not own the means of production. The employer does. In fact, even owning shares does not entitle one to control a business. You actually have to have voting rights. But anyway, we don't need to get into all that. But what is authority? Why do we have it? In order to understand authority, we first have to understand power. Every person and every institution has power. They have the ability to do something or to enforce something. On a basic level, very simple level, a strong person has the authority to compel a weak person to do something. Simple physical force. It's power. Now, authority is related but slightly different. Authority is the moral right to use power. Now, I can go outside and I can use my physical power to compel my neighbor to mow his lawn. Believe me, I've thought about it. But I am not allowed to do that. I don't have the moral license or right to do so. He does not have to listen to me. I don't have authority. However, the local bylaw officer does have the authority to compel my neighbor to mow his lawn. I'm not going to say whether that power has been used, but it is certainly helpful in the right instance. So that's your clear difference, right? Just because you can do something doesn't mean you're allowed to. Now, another example, for example, would be driving in traffic. Here we have a classic example. If someone in traffic is misbehaving, am I in another car allowed to punish them for their decision? Yet who here can say that they have not attempted such a thing? We have the power to punish other drivers through driving ahead of them and cutting them off, or honking loudly, or yelling, all these things. We have ways of punishing other people in traffic. But only the police are given the authority to actually exercise power to compel people to drive better. Every day we have to remember this. Difficult lesson. So, authority is massively important. Why is authority so important? Well, authority is important because if you don't have authority as a concept, then might makes right. If I'm more powerful than you, I get to decide how things work. And that is extremely dangerous. Think about it this way. Here's one danger. Consider our children, for example. Our children are commanded to obey their parents. But imagine they had to obey all parents. What would that do to our children if my neighbors who are not Christians had the right to tell my children what to do just because they wanted to? See, part of the thing about children is that they're inherently weak. They're weak and they're vulnerable, and therefore any adult can have their way with them. Authority is given by God to protect children from that. Only their parents get to tell them what to do. Although, sure, in the church we have a village mentality to some extent, and we have some authority over each other's children, but ultimately authority is given to protect the weak from the strong who use power wrongly. That is what it is for, at least on human terms. Most people In our culture, we've gotten to a point where we think that authority is bad for the weak and the vulnerable, and therefore we should have less authority or no authority. This is a devastating and wrong concept that will ultimately harm the weak. For example, you all know the Black Lives Matters movement, and the goal there was to defund the police. The police have hurt people, therefore we shouldn't have police. And so when certain cities decided to defund the police, what happened? Who suffered the consequences of that? The weak and the vulnerable. Because the police are a legitimate force that combat the misuse of power by sinful and wicked people. That is at least when they're operating properly. When there's no authority, the strong can become totalitarian, doing whatever they want. Again, in Canada, right, only our prime minister can make laws. And see, here we have a classic example with the tariffs and Donald Trump. It is a blessing. Authority in Canada is a blessing because it means that only our prime minister can tell us what to do within his sphere. And here we have a situation where Donald Trump is trying to assert his authority over Canada, and we're saying you don't have that right. If we didn't have a concept of legitimate authority in this country, any strong power in the world could just walk in here and tell us what to do. It would be devastating. So again, authority is a blessing. Power will always exist. The question we should ask is there authority to protect us from the misuse of power or not? So, God establishes structures of authority because he wants blessing for us and good for us. We just saw that this morning in Jeremiah 29. So, now in the Bible, there's a bit of a layering to this. It's not always easy to see it in the English, but there are different words used in different passages for how and why we obey. The first layer, number one, is what you see in Ephesians 6, verse 1, and that's Paul says to the children, obey your parents. And the word used there, eurakao, is to follow instructions. It's very clear. The parents give instructions, and the children are to carry them out. Right? So children should, that's sort of the first layer of authority. When someone tells me something, I jump, I do it, I go. And the Bible basically lands in that place with the role of children. Yes, there's far more to raising children, I get it, and we don't want to just tell them what to do, sure. But basically speaking, the Bible is saying when your parents tell you to do something, as a child, you ought to do it. Okay? Unless your parents are sinful. I'll come back to that in a minute. The second layer, below obedience, is the word submission. Now, sometimes the Bible says submission, sometimes it says be subject to. And I love that way of saying it. It's a very good translation. And what it means is the word is hupotasso. And this word is to place yourself underneath voluntarily. In the Bible, whenever the word submit is used, the person who is in authority is not really in their rightful position to compel submission or to demand it. The word is always best used as a command to the one underneath to voluntarily become subordinate. And of course, it's not the same thing as obedience, right? And again, you see this in Ephesians, right? Earlier on about wives and husbands, and especially, is this, so it says here, right? First, Paul says in verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. You see that? In any position, any time you're in the church here with any person in the church, put yourself second. Be satisfied to be subordinate to each other. Okay? Start. Now number 2, verse 22. Then it says, wives, submit yourselves to your, hear that? Your own husbands. Not someone else's husband, your own. Place yourself under him. Follow him voluntarily. It does not say in verse 22, husbands, make sure your wives follow you and obey you. Any husband that seeks to enforce such a command is sinning. The command is from Christ to wives voluntarily. It's critical to understand this. Well, the man's job is to lead appropriately so that it's a joyful thing to follow him. That's the key. Now, this is not the only instance of what we would use submission. The concept of it. There's another, Romans 13 is another instance of what we would call voluntary submission. And that's, you see the same word used there. Right? 13 verse 1, let everyone be subject to the governing authority. So you have to voluntarily decide to place yourself under the current governing of the land. Now, I'm going to get to what happens when they overstep in a minute. But fundamentally, that's our posture towards government. The government should not have to compel Christians to obey or submit. We should be voluntarily making it easy, and by doing that as a starting point. I'll get to the other side of that in a minute. Now, also, 1 Peter 5 in the church. And Paul gives the same command to the younger members of the church. And he says there, 1 Peter 5 verse 2, be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you are willing. It's not verse 2. It's verse 5. In the same way, you who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders. See? Same thing. It's not saying, I can't sit here and say to you, and shouldn't sit here and say to you, hey, all you have to obey your leaders in the church. Do it. It's more, Christ is saying to you, you voluntarily be subordinate and follow. And all my job, I just simply communicate that to you, and it's for you to carry out. Marriage, same dynamic as I've said. So this is the first layer. So you have obedience, you have submission, and now there's a third layer, I would say, and it's the word honor. And that's the word you see in the fifth commandment, honor your parents. Okay. And this word, in Hebrew, this word simply means to be heavy. So treat your parents with great weight. In other words, don't take their authority lightly. Don't treat people in authority over you lightly. Give them a lot of weight in your thinking and in your life. Honor them. Now, I find this word honor very important because this is where I'm going to get to the flip side of authority. If I have to honor authority, then I'm not supposed to worship it. I mean, I'm not supposed to obey those in authority unquestioningly. I honor them. Very different concepts versus obedience and honor. They're related but different. In fact, therefore, honoring godly authority might mean disobeying that authority in the sake of the higher authority of God. I'm honoring this office of prime minister by not doing the evil thing the person in that office is requiring of me. But the word honor also helps me understand how I would disobey, when I would disobey. And I would disobey in such a way that I honor the person and the office that I'm potentially disobeying. I would never, ever disrespect them. I would disobey in such a way that it would be clear to them that I have their best interests at heart. And that I serve God, and that my God is a God of order, and my God is a God of love, my God is a God of honoring authority. If the authorities get the impression that I hate them, or that I I'm disrespectful to them, that is not God honoring. I honor God by honoring his authorities that he set in place, even when they're evil. Doesn't mean I always disobey them. My favorite example of this is when David meets Saul in the cave. This is the Old Testament, right, where Saul is chasing David around Israel. Now, what's interesting about Saul is chasing King David with his little band of men, and David is disobeying Saul every day. Saul is a legitimately appointed king. God appointed him. David is disobeying him. But what's fascinating is that when Saul comes into the cave, he goes in to relieve himself. David and his men are in the cave, and David's men say to him, "Go kill him. It's your enemy. He's put into your hands. Knife him in the back." And David says, "I'm not doing that. God put him in authority over me. I dare not touch him." Interesting whether Bonhoeffer would have interpreted that passage, by the way, for those of you who know Bonhoeffer. I'm not sure I agree with it. Anyway, we'll leave that. So David does not touch him, so he honors the authority. But then Saul leaves the cave, and David comes out of the cave and does something incredibly dangerous and bold. He comes out of the cave and tries to convince Saul to stop chasing him. And in my view, what he's doing is he's trying to reach Saul's heart. He's trying to turn Saul. "Saul, I love you, my father. Why? Don't do this. Look at me. I don't mean to harm you. I don't want to harm you. I honor you." And in the moment, he does reach Saul, but Saul later on turns on him again. Perfect example of how we can disobey illegitimate uses of authority by honoring the person and yet disagreeing with them. So we honor them, we appeal to them, we try any means possible to reason with them. In fact, the Belgian Confession, one of our confessions that we use here in this church, is an exact example of that very thing. The Belgian Confession was written by Guido de Brez's attempt to try to appeal to the persecuting Roman Catholic authorities of Holland and Belgium. That's why the whole thing was written. An example of attempting to reason with unjust authority. Very good example. You can think of the midwives in Egypt, for example. Another good example of that. John the Baptist speaks truth to power to Herod. He calls out the sins of Herod. He pays with his life, of course. But at the same time, I think he was right to do what he did. And the Catechism also uses an interesting term here. It says at the end of Lord's Day 39, he says, "Have patience with their weaknesses and shortcomings of those in authority over you, since it is God's will to govern us by their hand." Be patient with those who are in authority. Their job is not easy. Give them a lot of, again, honor. Give them a lot of weight. Give them a lot of patience. Give them a lot of time. Reason with them before you criticize or gossip or other things like that. This is sort of the tone of the Catechism. When you're a child and your parents are doing things that you don't like and you don't appreciate, be patient and give a lot of due. Right? That's the command. That's the tone of Scripture. Now, it is the norm. So I've talked about potential situations of disobedience, and that's definitely possible. We should never underestimate that. But the norm is this: be subject to. Our intent, our norm is that we're working to be subordinate to legitimate authorities. That's the broad 95% thrust of Christian life. So we shouldn't get that balance wrong. Now, to finish, one more thing. This commandment comes with a reward. Your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. No other commandment has a reward attached to it like this one. And it seems to me that the reward has two layers. And one layer is honoring a godly authority, or even a not so godly authority. Honoring that authority from the heart must necessarily lead to a better life in itself. And if God's not included for a minute, that in itself is just a good idea. Let's put it this way. Even if the government in Canada is sort of unjust and not the best government, and we're kind of question it, we as a country are far better off to obey that government than to instead institute revolution and create anarchy. Revolution is infinitely worse than the Trudeau government, for example. The French learned that the hard way. As bad as the French kings were, the French Revolution was far, far worse. So this reward that God is giving, even without God's involvement in things, which we'll get to in a minute, makes sense. Societies that honor authority are peaceful societies, even if the authority is not very good. In fact, the early church fathers used to talk about this quite a bit. They would always say, a bad government is better than no government at all. The church fathers repeated this quite often. It's a way to remind their Christian members that as bad as the persecution was, they should be very reluctant to consider revolution. So the early church kind of really had a strong opinion on that. And let's talk about children for a minute on that point too. Children who fail to listen to their parents, so much trouble. And church leadership, same principles apply. You may not even like the things that the church leadership is doing. You may not agree with them. But you're far better off to remain in the church under leadership than to go live on your own and not live under authority. So, okay, but secondly, God, it seems to me when I read this commandment that God explicitly rewards those who actually obey this. 1 Peter 5 verse 5, Peter actually quotes Proverbs 3 verse 34. You can see that in this chapter. He says, you who are younger in the church, submit yourselves to the elders, all of you. And then he says next, all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud but shows favor to the humble. And the implication is that any attempt to resist authority, there's got to be pride in that. But those who are content to live under authority and to honor it, God likes that. He appreciates that. That's something that he himself honors. And I don't think it's a stretch to then say God helps and honors those who obey this commandment. And the Israelites, of course, had to learn this lesson the hard way, because the Israelites lived in Canaan, and the number one principle of living in Canaan was to submit to God's authority. And if they did submit to God's authority in Canaan, they would receive protection from God and prosperity. They did not do that. They did not submit to God's authority, and therefore they lost his direct promises of blessing. So we learned this morning about that as well. So it seems to me that if you are a person who submits to authority willingly and works hard at doing that and seeks to do that, there will be positive rewards for that from God and in itself. Now, the best thing of all is that God the Father has given all authority to Jesus Christ. The man who died to save us is also the man who is given every single shred of ultimate authority on heaven and earth. That's incredible. The kindest man is given the most power. It says there in Ephesians 1 verse 19, that power, hear that? The power given to Christ, that power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead, seated him at his right hand in the heavenly realms, far above, hear this, all rule and authority, power and dominion, and every name that is invoked, not only in the present age, but also in the one to come. Oh, the good news. The most powerful man is the best man. Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And his power and authority is always... So in Jesus, power and authority are united. The power is given to the man who should have authority, and he exercises it perfectly justly. He punishes those who disobey exactly the right way and the right proportion. He rewards those who deserve... Everything happens exactly right, except one detail. He is dramatically unjust in giving you and I grace and dying on our behalf. And so he bends he organizes the principles of God's justice to give us grace that we don't deserve. That's what he uses his power and authority to do. And so Jesus always wins, and he wins in his love and his grace. And do not fear. He will punish those who misuse their authority, whether in the family, church, or the civil government. Do not fear. And that is how we can be patient with the shortcomings of those in authority, because the grand man in authority, Jesus Christ, will set everything right with his authority. He's got it. So we can be patient while we await the King of Kings. Amen.